Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Rohini, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto Department of History. And I'm here in Toronto, the traditional land of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Today, my talk is titled Chemical Production and Imperial Crossings on the Grand River, 1960 to 1971. I will look at a historical moment when a chemical company called Uniroyal produced Agent Orange on the Grand River in Elmira, which is in Ontario, Canada, during the Vietnam War, and it was produced for the United States Department of Defense to deploy this in the war. I will consider two interrelated dimensions of this moment. First, the way that this land was made, both necessary to and yet expendable for capitalist and imperialist production. And second, I'll more closely consider some of the ecological implications in Elmira of producing toxic chemical war munitions during this period. While my study is localized on the Grand River area in Southern Ontario, I have to discuss it together with events in Southeast Asia to give proper articulation to this history. I argue that this moment rendered visible some of the ways that empires converged in the post-war period through military production networks. So by way of a brief background, Elmira is situated along the Haldimand Tract, which is land that was granted to the Six Nations of the Grand River, or Haudenosaunee Confederacy, in 1784. If you look at the map on the left, Elmira is proximate to Kitchener, where the yellow patch is. And as you can see, it is located really in the heart of the Great Lakes watershed, which is one of the major and greatest freshwater lake systems in the world. Elmira is connected to the Grand River, which joins into Lake Erie at the bottom there. Elmira was a small rural working class settler town at the turn of the 20th century, and the picture on the right depicts its rural and agricultural landscape. The chemical plant in Elmira was owned and operated by Naugatuck Chemicals since the 1940s, and this plant would later be rebranded as Uniroyal. The company was owned by Dominion Rubber Company, which was the Canadian subsidiary of the US conglomerate United States Rubber Company. Naugatuck in Elmira was a chemical manufacturer from the start, not solely because it produced chemicals necessary for the synthetic rubber production process, but also largely for wartime chemicals, such as aniline for explosives during the Second World War. In the post-war period, the company then expanded its image as an asset to farming communities, producing goods and chemicals that were promised to assist in agricultural abundance and economic growth. The plant was, and still is under its current ownership, located on the Kanegagig Creek, which leads into the Grand River. Naugatuck produced pesticides like DDT and other products catering to individual consumers for household use, such as weed killers, and or municipal and provincial users like city caretakers, and also hydroelectric developers, for example, that would clear vast expanses of unwanted plant life where infrastructure might be built. One of the chemicals that became increasingly important to its output and production was called 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid, or 2,4-D, which was a chemical plant auxin, or plant hormone growth regulator, which is a type of herbicide. Pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, all ending in "cide" indicated their intention, which was to kill. For example, herbs or plants that were classified as weeds or invasive creatures that were classified as pests, fungal life, etc. So this gives some indication into their applications too, or their work as technologies, which was to eradicate what was not useful or wanted in nature, or in other words, to organize nature in a particular way or in particular ways by eliminating what wasn't considered useful or valuable. 2,4-D became so important to the company's production that by the 1950s, Naugatuck celebrated that it was the main supplier of this chemical to the Western prairies, where farmers were taking up the chemical in new scales. These chemical technologies were meant to advance particular ecological forms that favored capital, such as commodity monocrop agriculture, and other non-agricultural sites too, like forest plantations and timber cultivation. So by 1960, Elmira was firmly established, Naugatuck was firmly established in Elmira as a chemical producer in Canada, which was both locally important in Ontario, but also networked into US and other markets as well. Naugatuck was also one of the only pesticides producers in Canada at the time, which enmeshed it into several food commodity chains. And this was also the post-war period, which was, of course, which also meant that it was the Cold War period. And indeed, the geopolitical tensions and conflicts that characterized the Cold War were well underway. Pesticides, herbicides, and other agrochemical technologies were entangled in these geopolitical tensions in sometimes unobvious ways. But the question for global food production and food security was one of the central nodes where chemical technologies were tied in. Turning our attention elsewhere, in a major heated conflict of the Cold War, the US military initiated Operation Ranch Hand in the Vietnam War in 1962. The goal of the operation was to eradicate foliage and plant life, to deny cover for insurgents fighting for North Vietnam, as well as targeted crop destruction to deny them of food sources using an array of chemical technologies. Securing supplies for the chemical constituents of the main munitions used in this operation therefore became integral to carrying out and sustaining this strategy. Dow Chemical was one of the first and major suppliers of what became known as Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a chemical combination of approximately equal parts of two products, 2,4-D, which I mentioned earlier, and 2,4,5-T, which was also already being produced at Naugatuck in Elmira. Other chemicals were also used in these operations, such as Agent Blue, White, Pink, and so on, which were constituted by different combinations of also 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, sometimes in many of them, and other toxic compounds as well, such as picloram and arsenic. And collectively, these were termed the rainbow herbicides. In other words, this campaign to defoliate the jungle was rooted in, domination, counterinsurgency, and interrupting a major movement towards decolonization. Tree and plant life and people in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, all the places that the Vietnam War took place, were devalued by the US ranch hand missions that considered both merely an obstacle to be removed, which chemicals like the rainbow herbicides would facilitate. That said, in many ways, the aerial use of these herbicides were not entirely unscrupulous. In his book called Rubber and the Making of Vietnam, An Ecological History, Michitake Aso gives us some stunning insights from the late 1960s. I quote from page 261 and 2 in his book. And he said, a combination of plantation directors' complaints about the extensive tree cuttings and damage to plantation infrastructure during US military operations granted plantations a new lease on life. The Mission Interagency Committee on Plantations met in June and emerged with a secret report recommending a US policy regarding plantations. The results of 9 months of research, this report saw a hopeful future for natural rubber in post-war Vietnam and the world, despite the current threats. It argued that the basic objective of US policy should be the preservation of the plantations and their infrastructure. In practical terms, this meant that the US or free world forces must try to avoid damaging the plantation, either through felling or slashing of trees, damaging or destroying processing plants, etc. But during the savage retreat of the early 1970s, US and RVN violence ended rubber production and threatened to destroy plantations as B-52 bombing runs collapsed tunnel systems and roam plows, and herbicides such as Agent Orange flattened rubber trees. Companies such as Michelin even attempted to sue the US military for damages. I know that was a long quote, but it was really important. And that is just to say that the selective application of herbicides was not considered to protect civilians of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and neither was land or food protected. Plantations, however, owned by US, French, and other corporations like Michelin, were protected from the herbicides to the extent that they were valuable, again, to capital. As the US military escalated this herbicide offensive strategy in the war, the Department of Defense, the US Department of Defense contracted several chemical corporations beyond Dow to maintain and expand its supplies. In 1965, Dow Chemical officials invited representatives from other Agent Orange producing companies, including Monsanto, Hooker, and Uniroyal, to its headquarters in Midland, Michigan, which is pictured here, to discuss concerns over the toxicity of one of the Agent Orange constituents, 2,4,5-T. An invitation letter dated March 15th, 1965 reads, "Gentlemen, I'm writing this same letter to each of you. I have talked with some of you, and you have indicated the other persons within your own organizations who should be present. As per these telephone conversations, I'm inviting each of you to come to Midland to discuss the toxicological problems caused by the presence of certain highly toxic impurities in certain samples of 2,4,5-trichlorophenol and related materials. As I told all of you with whom I have talked, we have been doing analytical and toxicological research on this problem and wish to share our findings to date with all the producers of 2,4,5-T for the sole purpose of lessening any hazards to health that might be attributed to this and related products." And it was signed by V.K. Rowe of the Biochemical Research Laboratory at Dow in Michigan. Although Uniroyal was not addressed in this particular letter, discovery papers from a veteran's lawsuit about Agent Orange that came up later in the 1980s acknowledged that a Uniroyal official was in attendance and correspondence with Dow during this time. Despite the gathering of chemical corporation representatives in Michigan in 1965, Uniroyal was contracted by the DoD in 1966, a year following the Dow meeting, and began its Agent Orange production in Elmira. Though it was a US company, Uniroyal slated the Elmira site on the Canadian side of the border for production. And the company produced both 2,4,5-D and 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, which were the constituents of Agent Orange. Military contracts for this and other herbicides ostensibly had specifications that distinguished them from commercial production, which likely meant that they were higher in concentration or less diluted for more potent, fast-working effects on the plants, jungles, broadleaf brush, crops, and so on that they were intended for. Military and government officials would come to persistently refer to Agent Orange as a tactical weapon rather than a chemical weapon, which depended on its rationalizing principle that human health and land were fundamentally separable. And insofar as there was insufficient scientific evidence to corroborate that it was toxic to human health, its use was simply tactical and negated of any violence. Canada's national stance towards the Vietnam War in terms of diplomatic relations and international relations was neutral. But that this Agent Orange production took place in Canada was not an anomaly in its actual material participation in the war and allegiance to the US. In fact, the Elmira production site was not even unique in terms of Canadian involvement, specifically with Agent Orange in the Vietnam War. Chris Arsenault has documented the history of Agent Orange testing at the Canadian Forces base in Gagetown, New Brunswick during the 1950s and 1960s. Even so, today, Elmira does not feature on authorized registers of Agent Orange exposures, whether through the US government recognition for its Department of Veteran Affairs or in Agent Orange exposure sites recognized by the federal government of Canada. It was also not well known, at least initially among workers and residents in Elmira, that the herbicide that was becoming so notorious in the war was being produced in the local factory, nor were the full implications of this clear. Dow was known to be a major munitions producer for the US military in the Vietnam War, including producing napalm as well as Agent Orange, and as such was a target of anti-war activists both in the US and Canada. Uniroyal, on the other hand, evaded most attention. By 1966-67, to 1969, scientists had already galvanized to petition the US president to stop the use of herbicides in the war because of the warnings of toxicity that they were aware of, associated with issues like physiological developmental harms and other types of teratogenic repercussions. Because of the complexities in understanding synthetic chemicals like Agent Orange and how they're entwined into social and material structures, several theorists like Max Lieberon, Michelle Murphy, Manuel Tironi have offered important interventions in how we study synthetic chemicals, both contemporarily and historically. And historian David Biggs, for example, who has written extensively on military ecological landscapes in Vietnam, outlines some key insights into Agent Orange in his article called Following Dioxin's Drift, which traces 2,4,5-T through military and commercial networks across spatial and temporal scales. So in the Grand River, we see that the greater place that producing Agent Orange alongside other chemicals was coming into convergence with the creeks, the company grounds, underground in waste, runoff into the main river, exposure of workers who were handling and packaging the chemicals, and more. So while the chemical made its way from above through aerial spraying in Southeast Asia, around Elmira, it made its way into the Grand River and Haudenosaunee lands and waters through the exerted influence of chemical corporations and military contracts from above. . In Elmira, the production of Agent Orange and similar chemicals continued, and many indications show that, if anything, the company was primarily oriented towards continued productive expansion at this point in the mid-1960s, including new plant buildings, marketing 2,4-D, and new products similar to it, other plant hormone regulators, for example, and locking down a plan for a joint municipality company wastewater treatment plant. This would grant the company continued access to local water supplies, but also distribute the costs for treating the water with the municipality, despite its disproportionately large use of the water and its disproportionately large role as a waste producer, insofar as it was necessary to facilitate its continued production. And this production, alongside the array of other chemicals being produced on site, intensified the potential for toxicity in Elmira. The disposal and waste processes used by the company were a crucial medium through which these chemicals entered surface water, groundwater, soil, air, plant and animal life, and chemical disposal methods included things like burying waste drums, and filling waste pits on site. In the picture on the right, it's just a snapshot from the Canadian magazine Maclean's from the mid-1960s, which is proclaiming the death of Lake Erie at the bottom of the Grand River. And sites like Elmira give us insight into the kinds of activities that led to a moment where the lake was visibly suffering from these kinds of industrial capitalist operations. By 1968, the Division of Industrial Waste of the Ontario Water Resources Commission released a report studying the implications of industrial waste in the late 1960s at Elmira's Uniroyal site. The report went so far as to say that this case was one of the most persistent and outstanding pollution problems in Ontario. And even so, production was uninhibited. The authors of the study had set out to examine the sources and characteristics of waste from the Uniroyal site. And the authors noted that in the early 1960s, farmers in the community had lost cattle to poisoning, which they attributed to the toxicity of the Kananaiget Creek where the cattle were watered. Importantly, the authors noted that recent biological survey data indicates the complete absence of all but a small number of the most pollution-tolerant species of aquatic biota in the creek downstream from Elmira to its confluence with the Grand River. And significantly, the line of demarcation for this condition is the main cooling water discharge of the Uniroyal plant. So this was consistent with community reports of dying livestock and startling reductions of fish populations in the 1960s. And the report also concluded that seepage from the waste equalization lagoon system at the Uniroyal plant and the 2,4-D waste pits were the most likely sources of this contamination. However, this government body's explicit attribution of Elmira's contamination harms to 2,4-D was not articulated, framed within, or even connected to any discussion of the chemical as an Agent Orange constituent. Furthermore, a telling afterthought stated that it is perhaps fortunate that downstream agricultural users of the Kananaiget Creek have alternate sources of water, and that there is no significant urban development on the creek downstream from Elmira. And this framing belied the fact that farming communities, Indigenous communities, and other municipalities and settlements, and the major Six Nations Reserve were interconnected with and downstream from the Kananaiget Creek and the Grand River, and instead rendered them disconnected from Uniroyal's toxicity under this form of provincial environmental science. I'll kind of skip this point, but I just wanted to say that this this precedent set by Elmira also had effectively produced cheap natures in this location and facilitated further path dependencies for more chemical production, whether it was Uniroyal's own production or other companies that came to produce something in Elmira. So just as a final remark, on the one hand, Agent Orange was manufactured and packaged for the military destruction of landscapes in Southeast Asia and to facilitate US counterinsurgency. And on the other hand, the everyday operations of agribusiness filling military contracts in Elmira and the exposures to and wastes of these chemicals translated to the ongoing alteration of the Grand River lands and waters and perpetuation of settler colonial relations in the 20th century. So what are the boundaries of empire? War theaters like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were the heart of overtly imperialist aggression. And the politics of chemical production in Elmira and elsewhere across indigenous lands were also irrevocably part of the continual processes of remaking and fortifying empire. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you more.